Hi everybody and welcome to Arabic with Amina. Today's video is going to be about the Arabic alphabet. In Arabic we call it Al-Abjadiyya. Al-Abjadiyya. This is the Arabic alphabet and it consists of 28 letters. Unlike English, Arabic is written from the right to left direction. So the first letter for this alphabet starts here and then we were going to go that way. Al-Abjadiyya, the alphabet. Each letter can be written in a different way according to its location in the word. If we are writing only one letter, we're going to call that position alone. If the letter is written as the first letter of the word, it has its own way of being written, such as this letter here in Al-Abjadiyya. It differs also if it's written in the middle of the word, such as these letters, or if it's written as the last letter of the word, such as this one right here. We're going to be talking about each position for each letter in this video. When a letter is connected to the letter after it, that makes it a friendly letter. And if the letter does not connect to the letter after it, we're going to be calling that a mean letter. So you can see in this example here that this letter is connected to this letter by this line. So we're going to be calling this one a nice letter, a friendly letter. As you can see here, this letter right here is not connected to the letter after it. There's a small space, and this will be a mean letter. You'll see more when we talk about each letter with its own example. So our first letter is going to be Alif, which is the equivalent to the letter A in English. And this letter is a mean letter, meaning it does not attach to any letters that come after it. This is the shape of Alif in the alone state. The thing on top is called a hamza, and it can be written with or without it. The way we write Alif in the beginning of the word is similar to its standalone position, such as in my name, Amina. You can notice that there is a space between Alif and the letters coming after it, and this is because it is a mean letter. In the middle of the word, we write Alif like this. For example, in the word tufah, which means apple. It is connected to the letter before it because the letter before it is a friendly letter. But because Alif itself is a mean letter, it is not attached to the letter after it. And this is how we write Alif in the end of the word. For example, in the word hayya, which means come on. So we can write Alif like this, a backwards 2 with a line underneath. The 2 on top is called a hamza, and when it is present, it gives a little to the word. So, Amina. But when it is not written, it's just a soft A. Our next letter is the letter Ba, which is the equivalent to the letter B in English. But since Arabic does not have the letter P, if your name starts with the letter P, you would write the letter Ba instead, even though it's a B. And this letter is a friendly letter, meaning it attaches to the letters that come after it. And this is how we write Ba in the standalone position. And this is how we write it in the beginning of the word. For example, in the word Bait, which means house. And this is how it looks in the middle of a word. For example, Mabna, building. And this is how it looks like in the end of a word. For example, the word Turab, dirt. Notice how the Alif did not connect to the Ba after it. The third letter is the letter Ta, which is the equivalent to the letter T. This is a friendly letter, and it's written similar to the letter Ba, except there's no dot underneath, and instead it has 2 dots on top. This is how we would write it in the beginning of a word. For example, the word Turab, which is dirt. And this is how it is in the middle of a word. For example, Mitr, which is meter. And this is how it would look like in the end of a word. For example, Bait, house. Now sometimes people write ta with 2 dots on top. And sometimes people, instead of writing 2 dots, will just write a line on top. And that line represents 2 dots. Next is the letter Tha, which would be th in English, such as in the word 3, and not in the word the. So it is a soft th, the, 3. The th in the word the is different and is represented by another letter in Arabic. This letter is a friendly letter, and in its standalone position, it is written just like ta, except it has 3 dots, 2 below and 1 on top. In the beginning of a word, it would be written like this. For example, the word thameen, which means precious. And this is how it's written in the middle of a word. For example, kathir, which means many. And this is how it's written at the end of a word. For example, bahth, which is search. You can write the dots on that in different ways. We could write 2 dots with 1 dot on top. Or we could have the bottom 2 dots written as 1 line with 1 dot on top. Or you can write all 3 dots as an upside down V. Our next letter is Jim. Jim is the equivalent to the letter J in English, and this is a friendly letter. It is written alone in this way, and in the beginning of a word, it's written like this. For example, in the word jaru, which means puppy. The middle of the word is similar to the beginning, but it's connected to the letter before it if it's a friendly letter. For example, the word hijab. And this is how it's written in the end of the word. Just like the standalone position, but it's connected to the letter before it if the letter before it is friendly. For example, the word burj, which is tower. Now, the letter before jim here is not a friendly letter, so we're going to erase that line that connects it. Next is the letter ha, which is equivalent to H in English, but it is a strong H coming from the very back of your throat. Ha, ha. This is a friendly letter, and it's written just like jim, except it has no dot. And it's written the same way in the beginning of the word, just without a dot. For example, the word halib, which is milk. The middle of a word, bahr, which means sea. And at the end of the word, for example, milh, which means salt. Next is letter kha. Kha. Kha also comes from the back of your throat. And in English, we would write KH, kha. This is a friendly letter, and it's written just like jim and ha, except the dot is now on top. So this is how it would be in the beginning of a word. For example, kharuf, which means sheep. Middle of the word, for example, mukhadda, which is pillow. And this is at the end of the word. For example, tabbakh. Now, the letter Alif, which was our first letter in this video, we learned that it is not a friendly letter. So it does not connect to the letter after it. So we're going to erase the line that connects it to the kha. Next is the letter Dhal, which would be D in English. And this is not a friendly letter. It is a mean letter. This is how we would write it alone. And it's written the same way at the beginning of a word. For example, the word dub, which means bear. And this is the way it's in the middle of a word. For example, Medina, city. And this is at the end of the word. For example, balad, which means country. Now, to write it as handwriting, you can write it like this, almost a circle, or you can write it like this. Of course, my handwriting looks really bad because I'm using the computer. Next is the letter Dal sibling, Dhal. Dhal would be the equivalent to TH in the word the, so it's a hard TH, the. Not like the TH in the word 3, but the TH in the word the. And this too is a mean letter. It's written the same way as Dal, but it has a dot on top. And this is how it's written in the beginning of a word. For example, in the word Dhal, which means tail. This is the middle of the word. For example, ladid, which means delicious. And this is at the end of the word. For example, ustadh, which means teacher or professor. Now, the letter before Dhal in that word is Alif, and it's a mean letter. So we're going to separate the 2 letters and not connect them. Next is the letter Ra, which would be the letter R in English. And this too is a mean letter. This is how it's written alone. And this is how it is at the beginning of a word. For example, the word ratib, which means salary. This is the middle of a word. For example, kharuf, which means sheep. And this is at the end of a word. For example, bahr, which means sea. Next is almost like ra, but it's called zain, and it'd be the letter Z in English. And it's also an unfriendly letter. It's written the same way as ra, but it has a dot on top. So this is how it is in the beginning of a word. For example, zahra, which means flower. In the middle of a word, such as mazhariya, which means vase. And this is at the end of a word. For example, karaz, which is cherry. Now, the letter right before zain is ra. It's the same thing but without a dot. And we just learned that it is not a friendly letter. So we're going to remove that connection. Next is letter sin, which would be S in English. Now, there are two letters in the Arabic alphabet which would be translated to S in English. So sin would be more of a soft S, and the other letter which represents the letter S in English would be a hard S. But here, sin is a soft S. So this is a friendly letter, and this is how it is written alone. And this is at the beginning of a word. For example, the word sir, which means secret. And this is in the middle of a word. For example, kasel, which means lazy. And this is at the end of a word. For example, shams, which means sun. Next is very similar to sin. It's called sheen, which in English would be the letter SH. And it is also a friendly letter. It's written just like sin, but has 3 dots on top, 2 in the bottom row and 1 on top. This is how it would be in the beginning of a word. For example, the word shams, which is sun. This is the middle of a word. For example, mishmish, which is apricot. And this is at the end of a word. For example, wahsh, which means monster. Next is the letter sad, which is a strong S in English. Sad. For example, in the word saw, S-A-W, saw. And this is a friendly letter. And this is how we write it in the standalone position. And this at the beginning of the word. For example, sabr, which means patience. This is in the middle of a word. For example, lasus, which means thieves. And this is at the end of a word. And we're going to use the same example, lasus. The letter before sad here is not friendly, so we're going to erase the connection. Next is a letter very similar to sad. It's bod. In English, there's no actual equivalent, but we can say that DH is the closest. And this is a friendly letter. And it's written the same way as sad, except it has a dot on top. So this is how it is in the beginning of a word. And for example, bobbit. Bobbit. Notice how I pronounce it. It's a mixture between a TH and a D. Bobbit. Bobbit, which means officer. This is in the middle of a word. For example, the word mudahak, which means funny. And this is at the end of a word. For example, hawd, which means tank. And the letter before is not friendly, so we're just going to go and erase that connection. Next is the letter ta. And this is equivalent to the letter T. But we already learned about a letter that's equivalent to the letter T. So that one was a soft T, whereas this one is more of a stronger T. It's ta. Ta. When you pronounce it, you fill your mouth with the pronunciation. Ta. And this is a friendly letter. And this is how it's written in the standalone position. And this at the beginning of the word. For example, ta'ira, which means plane. Notice how you pronounce it. Ta'ira. And this is the middle of the word. For example, batta, which means duck. And this is at the end of the word. For example, tabit, which means officer. Next is a letter very similar to ta. It is dha. Its pronunciation is similar to the letter dhad, which was DH in English. And this is a friendly letter. And this is how we would write it alone. and this at the beginning of the word. For example, ظلام, which means darkness. Notice how I pronounce it. ظلام. This is at the middle of a word. For example, بوضة. And it's not connected to the letter before it because the letter before is a mean letter. So we're going to go ahead and erase that. This is how it is at the end of the word. For example, the word حظ, which means luck. Next is the letter عين. In English, there's no actual equivalent to this letter. This letter comes from the very back of your throat. We could say it's a very harsh double A. عين. This is how you would pronounce it. From the very back of your throat. And this is a friendly letter. This is how we would write it alone. And this is how we would write it in the beginning of a word. For example, in the word عين, which is the name of the letter. And it also means eye in English. عين. Notice the pronunciation. عين. This is how it is in the middle of a word. For example, the word لعبة, which means game. So when writing in the middle of a word, we would write it like this. This is our line. And then this is the letter عين. It's an upside down triangle. And then we continue our line. And at the end of the word, it would be written like this. For example, the word مع, which means with. We'll write عين at the end of the word. Is as shown on the screen, where we would make it an upside down triangle and then make it a curve downwards. Next is a very similar letter, غين. In English, we could say that this would be a GH. It also comes from the very back of your throat. غين. غ. غ. And it is also a friendly letter. It is written just like عين, but it has a dot on top. And this is how it would look in the beginning of a word. For example, the word غابة, which means forest. غابة. This is it in the middle of a word. For example, مغرب, which means sunset. And this is it at the end of a word. For example, صمغ, which means glue. Next would be the letter fa, and in English that would be the letter F. It is also a friendly letter, and we write it this way in the standalone position. Notice how the letter fa is written on the line. If this was a line of a notebook, all of it is written on top of the line. This will be important for the next letter. This is how it's written in the beginning of a word. For example, فأر, which means mouse. This is the middle of a word. For example, مفتاح, which means key. And this is at the end of a word. For example, خوف, fear. The letter before fa here is not friendly, so we're going to remove that connection. Next is the letter قاف. قاف. In English, we could write it as Q, but it's not really the equivalent to the letter Q. This letter also comes from the back of your throat, and it is a friendly letter. And this is how it is written in the standalone position. Remember when I told you the letter fa is written on top of the line? Well, the letter qaf is written like this. This part is above the line, whereas the rest is below the line. At the beginning of a word, all of it's on top of the line though, just like fa, but with two dots. For example, the word qird, which means monkey. This is the middle of the word. For example, the word faqat, which means only. This is at the end of the word. For example, the word daqa'iq, which means minutes. Next is the letter kaf. This would be the letter K in English, and it is a friendly letter. This is how it's written alone, and this is how it is at the beginning of a word. For example, the word kalb, which means dog. This is how it's written in the middle of a word. For example, maktaba, which means library. And at the end of the word, it's written the same way as the standalone position. For example, the word malik, which means king. Next is the letter lam. Lam would be equivalent to the letter L in English, and it is a friendly letter. This is how it's written in the standalone position, and in its relationship to how it's written on a notebook paper, this would be the line of the paper. At the beginning of the word, it's written like this. For example, lows, which means almond. At the middle of the word, Malik, which is king. And at the end of the word, for example, Layl, night. So this is always written on top of the line of a notebook, and this part would be written underneath. Now, if the letter lam, after it comes the letter alif, which was the first letter in the alphabet, it's written in a different way. It's written like this. That's how it's written, lam and alif, la. And for a fun fact, la means no. Now, if we were to put a letter behind this, for example, we put the letter ba, it would not be written this way. Instead, it would be written like this. So this is the lam, and this is the alif. It's written like this when we have a letter connected to the lam. But if there's no letter, and it's just lam and alif, it would be written like this. Next is the letter mim, which would be M in English. And it's a friendly letter. This is how it's written alone. And this is how it is at the beginning of a word. For example, the word Malik, which again is king. This is how it is in the middle of a word. For example, mishmish, which is apricot. And this is how it is at the end of a word. For example, balam. Now, notice here that this is the letter lam. We just learned how to write lam and alif. And alif is not friendly, so the meme should not be attached to the letter before it. So we're going to erase that connection. Next is the letter noon. Noon in English would be the letter N, and it's a friendly letter. This is how we write it alone, and this is how it is at the beginning of a word. For example, nar, which means fire. This is it in the middle of a word. For example, the word Medina, which means city. And this is how it is at the end of a word. For example, min, which means from. Next is a letter ha. Ha in English is H. There's also another letter in the alphabet, which is H in English too. That was the letter ha, which came from the back of your throat. This letter here is ha, and it comes from the front of your mouth. It doesn't come from the back of your throat. So it's H as in house, house. And it's a friendly letter. And this is how it is when it's written alone. And this is it at the beginning of a word. For example, the word hada, which means this. In the middle of a word, it looks a little bit different. For example, the word muhandis, which is engineer. And its shape at the end of the word is also different. It looks like this if it's connected to the letter behind it. For example, the word wedge, which means face. But if the letter before it was not friendly and it would not be attached to the letter before it, it'd be written as a circle. For example, in the word ittijah. Notice how it's written in different forms. The letter before last is the letter waw, which in English would be the letter W or O. And this is not a friendly letter. This is how it's written alone. Same way when it's written in the beginning of a word. For example, the word warda, which means rose. The middle of a word. For example, buda, which means ice cream. And this is it at the end of a word. For example, low, which means if. And our final letter is the letter ya. In English, this would be Y or E. And this is a friendly letter. This is how it's written alone. And this is it at the beginning of a word. The two dots are beneath it. For example, the word Yemen, which is a country. This is it in the middle of a word. For example, mazhariya, which is vase. And the letter before is not friendly, so it's not going to be connected. This is it at the end of a word. For example, the word wardi, which is pink. Now, it is not connected to the letter before it, so we're just going to erase that little connection. And since it's not connected to the letter before it, its shape is the same as if it was alone. And that's it for the whole alphabet in Arabic. But there's one thing I want to mention, and that is ta marbuta. Now, ta marbuta is not part of the alphabet, but it is written as a letter. It's just not part of the alphabet. This letter is neither friendly or mean, and I'll let you know in a bit why. This is how it's written when it's alone. And at the beginning of a word, it's not written because it never comes in the beginning of a word. And it never comes in the middle of a word. It only comes at the end of a word. At the end of a word, if it comes after a mean letter and it is not attached to the letter previous to it, it's written the way it is in the alone position. But if it is connected to the letter before it, it's written like this. For example, in the word buda, ice cream. So this is similar to the letter ha, which we just learned a few slides back. But this one has 2 dots on top. Well, how to pronounce this letter? Well, in this word, buda, but these little marks on top of the word are little vowels, and I have another video explaining those. But when you have a vowel on the ta marbuta, it becomes the letter T. So we just covered all of the Arabic alphabet letters. There are 28 letters, and these are all of them on the screen. The majority of these letters are friendly. Those in blue are friendly, and those in red are mean, meaning they do not connect to the letter that comes after them. So that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, please do subscribe for more videos, like, share, and comment below what you thought. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Arabic with Amina.